Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. In today's video, we'll be taking a look at the 2024 presidential election, specifically through a lens of a scenario that I have developed. So, of course, in 2016, we know Trump won the election because he flipped the states of Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. And in 2020, he lost. He held on to Ohio, but he lost because he lost Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, which have quickly become among the three most important states in American politics. So, we're going to be looking at a scenario in which Trump wins the presidency but does not win those three states. We're going to give him Ohio because I understand it's a part of the Rust Belt, but it doesn't really vote the same way. They're not politically in the same block, so I think it's a little unfair to characterize it as such. Same thing with Northern Indiana, which is even more Republican than Ohio is. So we're just going to keep Ohio in the Trump column. So with that being said, we're going to get right into it here. Obviously, I've given Biden these three Rust Belt states that are in question, and we are going to kind of look at the rest of these states and see what Trump would have to do to win the election without winning the Rust Belt. So the first states we're going to kind of get rid of here are the states that are either likely or safe for Trump in general. Minnesota is not one of those states, but we're going to look at just kind of getting these states out of the way because they're likely or safe for Trump. And in any scenario in which he's winning the election, he's not losing any of his likely or safe states, especially if he's already lost these three states. So again, he has very little margin for error. And that's going to get him to 149 electoral votes. And so the next spot he'd have to go is to Texas, because Texas is a must-win for Republicans if they want to win the presidency. Obviously, it's a state that has gotten more competitive in recent years, but it's still a Republican-leaning state, and it's still a state that if Republicans do want to win the presidency, they're going to have to win it. So that's the first thing I would like to say about Texas. The second thing I'd like to say is that the good thing that Republicans can be happy about in Texas is that if, in this scenario, they're losing the Rust Belt, it doesn't necessarily correspond to Texas because more suburban, more southern, more perhaps areas that are socially liberal voting for Republicans, whereas in the Midwest it's more populist, more socially conservative, but economically liberal. So they're kind of the opposite. They're trending in the opposite direction in many cases as well. So what Texas does does not really correspond to the Midwest. And it's a similar dynamic in North Carolina, which I expect in this scenario in which Trump is winning but losing the Rust Belt, he'd have to win North Carolina as well. It voted for him by 1.5 points in 2020, and obviously that was a very close margin, but Trump has to do what he has to do to win this election, and so he'd have to hold on to North Carolina, and that would be the next state up here. So from here it gets a little trickier because the rest of these states on this map voted for Joe Biden, except for Florida. Florida did not vote for Joe Biden in 2020, but the rest of these states did vote for Joe Biden in 2020, and that is a challenge for Trump because he has to flip states that are not in the Rust Belt. So the first of those I'd say would be Nevada. Nevada voted for Joe Biden by 2.4% in 2020, and that's a little more than Arizona or Georgia, but it still is a better state, I'd say, for Trump because it's more right-trending, and the largest county in the state, Clark County, did swing about 1.5 points to Donald Trump in 2020, which was pretty good swing considering that Trump did worse in most other regions surrounding it, like in Arizona and in California. So that is the first thing about Nevada. And just in general, Trump can certainly do better in the city of Las Vegas itself. I've already talked on Clark County, but Las Vegas is a lot of working-class voters who don't have college degrees, and that is a good demographic for Republicans they've been improving on. So Nevada, certainly doable for Republicans, but doesn't get them to 270. So the next state I think they need to win would be Georgia. Now, Georgia, of course, is a state that has historically been Republican, but Trump lost it in 2020. It was very close, but it's a problem for Republicans because it's very left-trending, and because, again, to win over a state like Georgia, you have to do very well with suburban voters, and Republicans have not done that in recent years. They lost the Senate race last year, and Trump obviously really collapsed with suburban voters, especially in Atlanta in 2020, and there's no reason to believe he'd do better 4 years later when the suburbs have gotten more liberal. So that's the problem for Trump. The good news is that there is a path. He can potentially improve in the city of Atlanta or have decreased turnout. He actually did better in some of the precincts within the city itself in 2020 than he did in 2016, which doesn't really mean much because they're still like 85% Democratic, but nevertheless, Trump did do better in some of those areas. And it's mostly a turnout thing, though. If turnout from Atlanta decreases, that helps Republicans. They can also hope that they can continue to improve in the southern part of the state and in rural areas. So Georgia is a very slim path for Trump in 2024, but in this scenario, he'd have to do it. So the final state that's kind of the easier flips to see would be Arizona. And Arizona, obviously, he won it the first time, which is a good thing for him. and he only lost it by like 10,000 votes in 2020. So it's certainly a very competitive state, and it has been very competitive these past 4 or 5 years. But the problem for Republicans here is that, like in Georgia, the big basket of population, which is in the case of Arizona in Maricopa County, Phoenix, is trending towards Joe Biden. Biden did 5% better than Clinton in Maricopa County. He flipped the county, he flipped the state. And that's a hard trend to counteract, especially when you consider how educated Maricopa County is, which makes it very likely to continue to swing against the Republicans. So Trump's path is in Arizona is kind of, I've talked about this a little bit, but it's kind of improving along the border in Yuma County, in Pima County, which are both counties that have significant Hispanic populations where Trump could do well. And he'd have to improve within the city of Phoenix itself. If not, the suburbs would have to have decreased turnout or stop losing by as much within the city of Phoenix itself. So it's a slim path like in Georgia, similar thing going on in Arizona, but it's going to have to happen. So now our final 2 electoral votes are going to be very hard to find because we've given him all of his 2016 states minus the Rust Belt. And there are a few ways we could go from here. We could go to Minnesota, which he lost by only around 1.5 points in 2016. We could go to Virginia, which he lost by 5 in 2016, but lost by a lot more in 2020. Or we can go to New Hampshire, which he lost by 2,000 votes in 2016. And I would say the best way to get to 270 electoral votes would first go through none of these states, because we're going to give him Nebraska's 2nd district, which he lost by 7% in 2020. And he really probably won't win it back, but just for the scenario, I think he'd win it before he won any of these other Clinton states. But then it kind of comes down to Minnesota or New Hampshire. And I think just because New Hampshire has been a bit swingier, because Minnesota just has a more liberal identity, and because we're already giving the rest of the Rust Belt to Joe Biden, we're going to give New Hampshire to Trump. We're going to give Minnesota to Biden. So that's going to do the map here. And we're going to look at this just once we have finished the visual aspect of it. But as you can see here, this is a very strange map electorally. It's just not really realistic. But again, it's always good to look at these scenarios because you never know what could happen. Obviously, in 2020, most people were not expecting Donald Trump to lose Georgia but win Florida and North Carolina, so you never know. But to talk about this map, I would say in New Hampshire, Trump would flip it just by really hoping that Republicans can get their game up there because, again, the problem that they've had in New Hampshire is that they've been losing educated voters. And New Hampshire is a very white state. It certainly has the demographics that Republicans could win in, but again, the voters in New Hampshire are very educated and they're very anti-Trump. Trump was very unpopular there in 2020, and that's why he lost the state by a pretty considerable amount. And so if you were to win it back in 2024, to win the election, you'd probably have to really, really improve with educated voters, which is not likely. It's why it's such a weird scenario, because he's really a poor candidate for educated voters. But let's say maybe we see the Democrats in New Hampshire become unpopular, or Joe Biden has a few gaffes on the campaign trail. And obviously, it's hard to see a state as blue as New Hampshire flipping, but in this scenario, it's the best shot Trump would have, especially if he's losing the Rust Belt. So that's the map. It's not a very likely map. It's not what I would think the Trump campaign would want to see. And the reason that this is an interesting video to make is because it shows the potential swing of our electoral map, but it also shows how hard it is for Republicans to win without the Rust Belt. Trump has to win one of Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and then hold on to those states in the South that I gave him. And that's a difficult thing to do, unfortunately, for him. He has a slimmer path than Biden does. So that's the video. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you all in the next video.